When did death become terrifying? Not tragic, not painful, but existentially terrifying. Today, death feels like an ending, a final interruption, a disappearance, a void. It is something we avoid speaking about directly, something hidden in hospitals, managed by professionals, separated from daily life. We fear it not only because it ends life, but because it isolates us, because it feels like falling into nothing. But this was not always the human experience. For most of history, death was not distant. It was visible, immediate, present. People died at home, they were washed by family, buried or burned by community, remembered collectively. Children saw it, adults spoke of it, religions structured life around it. Death was not abstract, it was integrated, and perhaps most strikingly, it was not always feared in the way we fear it now. Ancient civilizations built entire systems around continuity beyond death. Egyptians prepared for the afterlife as carefully as they prepared for harvest. Greeks spoke of Hades not as annihilation, but as transition. Romans honored ancestors as active presences within the household. In many indigenous traditions, death was not departure, but transformation. The question is not whether ancient people feared dying, they feared pain, they feared dishonor, they feared unfinished duty. But the meaning of death itself was different. It was not a rupture in existence. It was movement within a larger structure. Modern society often treats death as failure, a medical event, a system breakdown, a loss to be delayed as long as possible. Ancient societies treated death as an inevitability, and inevitability changes fear. When something is certain, predictable, and culturally integrated, it becomes manageable. When something is hidden, sanitized, and individualized, it becomes isolating. We live longer than any civilization before us, yet anxiety about death appears stronger. Why? What changed? Did ancient people possess stronger faith? Or did their societies construct death differently? To understand why they did not fear death the way we do, we must examine how they understood life. Because fear of death is not only about mortality, it is about meaning. And meaning, in ancient civilizations, was structured differently. Death was not an interruption of identity, it was part of it. For many ancient civilizations, death was not the opposite of life. It was part of a cycle. The Egyptians did not prepare for death out of panic. They prepared because they expected continuation. The body was preserved not out of denial, but out of belief. The soul would journey onward. Tombs were not symbols of despair, they were homes. The pyramids were not monuments to fear, they were architecture of continuity. In Mesopotamia, death was understood as descent into a shadowed realm, but not disappearance. The Greeks imagined the underworld as structured, governed, inhabited. Even in cultures where the afterlife was not idealized, it was defined. Defined death is less terrifying than undefined nothingness. In Rome, ancestors were not erased from daily life. They were invoked, honored, remembered publicly. Their presence shaped family identity. Lineage was continuity. Death did not sever belonging. Across many indigenous traditions, death was transformation, a return to land, to ancestors, to spirit. The individual dissolved into something larger, not smaller. In these systems, identity extended beyond the body, and that is crucial. Modern society locates identity primarily in the individual, in the singular self. When the individual ends, identity ends. Ancient societies located identity in family, lineage, tribe, city, cosmos. The self was not isolated, it was embedded, and when identity is embedded, death loses its finality. This does not mean ancient people were indifferent to dying. They mourned deeply, they grieved intensely, loss hurt. But grief is not the same as existential dread. Existential dread arises when death feels like annihilation. Ancient cosmologies resisted annihilation. The sun set and rose, seasons turned, crops died and returned. Nature modeled recurrence. Human life followed similar symbolic patterns. Even warrior cultures, which confronted death constantly, framed it within honor, memory, and continuation. To die in battle was not meaningless extinction, it was entry into story. Modern society often strips death of narrative. We medicalize it, we isolate it, we privatize it. Ancient societies ritualized it. Ritual gives structure. Structure reduces chaos, and chaos is what produces fear. When death fits within a worldview, it becomes comprehensible. When it stands outside one, it becomes terrifying. Ancient civilizations feared suffering, shame, dishonor, but death itself was rarely imagined as infinite nothing. They feared dying badly. We fear ceasing entirely, and that difference begins with how we define the self. To understand why ancient civilizations feared death differently, we must examine something more fundamental than religion. We must examine identity. Modern identity is individual. You are defined by your personal history, your preferences, your achievements, your internal experience. The self is treated as autonomous, separate from family, separate from community, separate even from tradition. When the individual self is central, death feels like total erasure, because what dies is the core of meaning. But ancient civilizations did not construct identity this way. In most early societies, identity was relational. You were someone's child, someone's parent, a member of a clan, a citizen of a city, a subject of a ruler, a participant in a cosmic order. The self was not isolated, it was embedded. Meaning came from belonging, and belonging continues. In Rome, a person's name carried ancestral weight. Family lineage extended backward and forward. Even after death, one's identity persisted in family, memory, and civic record. In China, ancestral veneration placed the dead within an ongoing familial structure. The deceased were not gone. They were repositioned within hierarchy. In Egypt, the afterlife was structured around continuity of role, status, and recognition. The dead were expected to participate in an ordered universe beyond the visible one. Identity was not destroyed by death. It was transferred. Even in societies with less formalized afterlife doctrines, the collective self persisted. Oral traditions preserved stories. Names were reused. Roles were inherited. This changed the psychological impact of mortality. If the self is deeply woven into a network that continues, death is transition. If the self is primarily internal and individual, death is termination. Modern culture places extraordinary emphasis on personal fulfillment and singular identity. This creates richness, but it also creates vulnerability. When meaning depends on individual continuity, mortality becomes absolute loss. Ancient societies diffused identity across time. You existed before you were born through lineage. You existed after death through memory, story, and ritual. The self was part of something durable. Fear intensifies when the self feels fragile. Ancient identity structures made the self less fragile because it was less isolated. Death did not erase the collective, it reconfigured it. This does not mean ancient people lacked fear. It means their fear was contextualized differently. They feared social dishonor. They feared dying without legacy. They feared spiritual imbalance. But annihilation was rarely the dominant terror. Modern existential fear grows in cultures that separate the individual from enduring structures. And once the self stands alone, death feels absolute. Ancient civilizations did not fear death the way we do because they did not define the self the way we do. Modern society hides death. It happens in hospitals, behind closed doors, managed by professionals, processed privately. Funerals are brief. Grief is individualized. Bodies are rarely seen. We encounter death through statistics, not presence. But in ancient civilizations, death was visible. People died at home. Children witnessed it. Bodies were prepared by family members. Burial grounds were close to cities, sometimes within them. Death was not removed from daily life. It was part of it. Visibility changes fear. When something is constantly present, it becomes integrated into psychological expectation. Ancient societies did not experience death as an abstract event that interrupted a protected existence. Life expectancy was lower. Illness was common. War was frequent. Infant mortality was high. Mortality was expected. Expectation reduces shock. Shock amplifies fear. Ritual played a critical role. Ritual provides structure. When someone died, there were prescribed actions: washing, wrapping, chanting, burning, burying, feasting, mourning periods. These rituals were not symbolic decorations. They were psychological frameworks. They told people what to do. They created order in chaos. They provided narrative. In Egypt, elaborate funerary rites were precise and intentional. In Rome, public mourning reinforced communal identity. In many indigenous cultures, death rituals involved the entire community. The individual was not left alone with loss. Grief was collective. Collective grief transforms fear into shared meaning. Modern grief is often isolated. Ancient grief was integrated. There is also something deeper at work. When death is hidden, it becomes unfamiliar, and the unfamiliar generates anxiety. When death is ritualized and present, it becomes normalized. Not trivial, not painless, but expected. Ancient architecture reflects this integration. Tombs were built with care. Burial sites were honored. Ancestors were invoked in domestic spaces. The dead remained part of the landscape. Today, cemeteries are often distant. Death is administratively processed. The transition from life to absence is managed quietly. In ancient societies, death reinforced social continuity. In modern societies, death highlights personal discontinuity. This difference matters. Fear grows in silence. Ancient civilizations surrounded death with language, structure, ritual, and repetition. Modern society surrounds it with avoidance. And avoidance feeds anxiety. The ancient world did not eliminate fear of death, but it diluted its isolation. When death is woven into daily existence, it loses some of its terror. When it is separated, hidden, and medicalized, it becomes foreign. And what is foreign feels threatening. Ancient civilizations did not fear death, less because they were naive. They feared it differently because they lived closer to it. Ancient civilizations did not simply believe in gods. They believed in structure. The universe, as they understood it, was ordered. It had layers, realms, forces, cycles. Death was not an anomaly within that structure. It was embedded in it. Modern fear of death often grows from uncertainty. What happens after? Is there anything at all? Is consciousness extinguished? Ancient societies rarely framed the question in those terms. For them, death had direction. In Egypt, the soul traveled through a defined journey, judged, weighed, tested, and ultimately placed within a cosmic order. The afterlife was not chaos, it was governed. In Mesopotamia, even a bleak underworld had rules. It was not undefined oblivion. Greek mythology gave death geography. Hades had rivers, gates, guardians. The dead crossed thresholds. Structure reduces terror. Undefined nothingness increases it. But beyond afterlife narratives, ancient cosmologies embedded humans within cycles larger than individual existence. Agricultural societies lived by seasonal return. Crops died and rose. Floodwaters receded and returned. Stars disappeared and reappeared. Nature modeled continuity. Death mirrored nature. Modern societies are more linear. We track progress forward. We emphasize innovation. We detach from seasonal rhythms. Our cosmology, even for many religious believers, is increasingly individual and abstract. Ancient cosmologies were communal and patterned. When existence is framed as cyclical, death becomes part of a loop. When existence is framed as linear and individual, death becomes a termination point. Even warrior cultures reveal this difference. Norse mythology promised entry into Valhalla, a continuation of identity through battle and honor. Aztec cosmology linked death to cosmic maintenance. Dying was participation in universal balance. These frameworks gave death purpose. Purpose reduces fear. Modern society often struggles to assign collective meaning to death outside personal grief. Without shared metaphysical structure, mortality becomes private. Private mortality is heavier. Ancient societies carried death within a shared symbolic architecture. Modern societies often carry it alone. This does not mean ancient people were less intelligent, less aware, or less capable of doubt. It means their worldview supplied answers before fear could expand unchecked. Fear thrives in ambiguity. Ancient cosmologies limited ambiguity. Whether those beliefs were metaphysically true is a different question. Psychologically, they were stabilizing. When the universe itself contains a map of death, individuals do not face it uncharted. Ancient civilizations feared suffering, injustice, divine punishment, but they did not confront death as meaningless void. Their universe had structure, and structure transforms terror into transition. Ancient civilizations did not eliminate fear, they redirected it. If death itself was structured, ritualized, and cosmologically mapped, what remained terrifying was not the act of dying, it was disappearing. To die without honor, to die without descendants, to die without memory. That was the deeper anxiety. In Homeric Greece, warriors did not fight to avoid death, they fought to secure Clio's glory remembered by others. Achilles chose short life with eternal fame over long life in obscurity. The terror was not mortality. It was insignificance. In Rome, political ambition was tied to legacy. Public monuments, inscriptions, triumphs, these were not vanity projects. They were defenses against oblivion. In China, ancestral continuity ensured that memory sustained identity. To leave no heir was tragic because it severed lineage. In Egypt, names were carved into stone because memory sustained existence in the afterlife. To erase a name was to erase presence. Across cultures, immortality was social before it was metaphysical. Memory was survival. Modern fear of death often centers on the end of personal consciousness. Ancient fear often centered on the end of recognition. There is a subtle but profound difference. When identity is collective, continuation happens through memory and lineage. When identity is individual and internal, continuation depends on consciousness itself. Ancient societies embedded immortality into culture. You lived on through story, family, monument, ritual. Modern societies offer fewer shared guarantees of remembrance. Family structures are smaller. Communities are more fragmented. Lineage carries less public weight. Legacy has become private, sometimes digital, sometimes ephemeral. Without strong communal memory, death feels more final. Ancient people sought to be remembered. Modern people often seek to extend life. These are different psychological strategies. Honor cultures transformed mortality into narrative. Shame and dishonor were feared more than death itself. A cowardly life was worse than an early death. Today, we often prioritize longevity over legacy. We extend life medically. We reduce risk socially. We isolate the dying from public narrative. Ancient civilizations place death at the center of identity. Modern civilization often places it at the edge of visibility. This shift alters fear. When death contributes to collective story, it becomes meaningful. When it interrupts individual experience, it becomes terrifying. Ancient people did not lack fear. They feared irrelevance. And in fearing irrelevance more than mortality, they reframed death itself. Something fundamental shifted over the last few centuries. Not our biology, not our mortality, our relationship to meaning. Modern civilization gradually moved from collective identity to individual identity. The Enlightenment elevated reason. The modern state elevated personal rights. Industrialization elevated mobility. Urbanization elevated anonymity. These developments expanded freedom, but they also redefined the self. You are no longer primarily your lineage. You are not primarily your tribe. You are not primarily your village. You are an individual, unique, self-defining, internally anchored. This shift has produced extraordinary achievements, creativity, autonomy, personal growth, but it has also changed how we experience death. When identity is collective, death transforms position. When identity is individual, death terminates existence. Modern thought increasingly treats consciousness as central, and if consciousness is central, its ending feels absolute. Ancient cosmologies embedded humans in enduring frameworks, divine order, ancestral continuity, cosmic cycles. Modern cosmology, especially secular cosmology, often presents a vast universe indifferent to individual existence. The self stands alone within it. Existential philosophy emerged in response to this isolation. Questions once answered by ritual and myth became personal dilemmas. What is the meaning of life? What happens when I die? Does anything persist? These are deeply modern anxieties. They are not necessarily new questions, but they have become internalized. Ancient societies externalized death. It was structured by religion, community, ritual. Modern society internalizes death. It becomes a private confrontation. Medical advancements extended lifespan and reduced daily exposure to mortality. This created safety but also unfamiliarity. When death becomes rare in daily life, it becomes alien. When it is alien, it becomes frightening. Modern culture often pursues youth and productivity as defenses against mortality. Ancient cultures often pursued honor and alignment with tradition. Modern fear is amplified by isolation. Many people confront death without communal rituals strong enough to contextualize it. Grief becomes individual therapy instead of collective transformation. Meaning becomes personal construction instead of inherited structure. This does not make ancient civilizations superior. It makes them different. They feared divine judgment. They feared social disgrace. They feared cosmic imbalance. We fear disappearance, and that fear grows when identity feels self-contained. Ancient civilizations did not fear death the way we do because the self was not constructed the way we construct it now. Modern individualism brought freedom. It also brought solitude in the face of mortality, and solitude intensifies fear. It would be easy to conclude that ancient civilizations were simply braver, that they faced death calmly, that they possessed stronger faith, that they were less anxious, but that would be a simplification. Ancient people feared famine, they feared plague, they feared violent death, they feared divine punishment. Mortality was not gentle. Life expectancy was lower. Child mortality was high. War was frequent. Their lives were physically more fragile than ours. And yet, their existential relationship to death was often less isolating. The difference is not courage, it is context. Fear does not disappear. It changes form. Ancient fear was embedded in cosmic order. Modern fear is embedded in personal uncertainty. Ancient people feared how they would die. Modern people fear that death itself erases meaning. This shift reflects something deeper. We live in a world that emphasizes autonomy. You build your own path. You define your own purpose. You choose your own beliefs. This freedom is powerful, but it means meaning is no longer guaranteed by structure. When meaning is inherited, death fits into narrative. When meaning is self-constructed, death threatens to interrupt unfinished identity. Ancient civilizations provided stable, metaphysical answers, whether accurate or not. Modern society offers options. Options create freedom. Options also create ambiguity. Ambiguity fuels anxiety, and then there is scale. Ancient societies were small. Death was visible, shared, witnessed collectively. Modern society is vast. Death is often processed individually. Isolation magnifies existential reflection. Technology also plays a role. We measure time precisely. We track lifespan statistically. We visualize medical risk in detail. Data makes mortality explicit. Ancient people experienced death, but they did not analyze it numerically. Modern awareness increases psychological exposure. We may not fear pain more than they did, but we may fear uncertainty more. Ancient civilizations integrated death into social architecture. Modern civilization integrates it into medical systems. One is communal, the other is procedural. So perhaps the question is not whether we fear death more, it is whether we face it alone, and whether solitude transforms mortality into something heavier. Ancient people did not eliminate fear. They distributed it across ritual, cosmology, and collective identity. Modern society concentrates it inside the individual, and concentration intensifies experience. Ancient civilizations did not conquer death. They contextualized it. They built rituals around it. They embedded it in cosmology. They tied it to lineage, honor, and continuity. Death was not a glitch in existence. It was part of the structure of existence. Modern civilization did something extraordinary. It extended life. It reduced suffering. It made mortality less visible. It gave individuals autonomy and choice. But in doing so, it altered the architecture of meaning. When identity shifted from collective to individual, death shifted from transition to termination. When ritual weakened, ambiguity grew. When cosmology fragmented, certainty declined. We gained freedom. We lost shared narrative. We gained longevity. We lost proximity. We gained individual identity. We lost collective continuity. The result is not necessarily greater fear, but a different kind of fear. Ancient people feared dishonor more than oblivion. We often fear oblivion more than dishonor. Ancient people saw themselves as threads in a fabric that extended beyond their lifespan. We often see ourselves as singular stories with defined beginnings and endings. Neither worldview is inherently superior. One offers structure, the other offers freedom. But structure absorbs existential weight. Freedom concentrates it, and so death feels heavier now, not because we are weaker, but because we carry it differently. Perhaps the lesson is not to return to ancient beliefs. It is to understand what they provided psychologically. They provided integration, they made death visible, communal, narratively contained. Modern society may not need their cosmology, but it may benefit from their willingness to speak of mortality openly, to integrate it into life, rather than isolate it from it. Ancient civilizations did not fear death the way we do, because death did not stand outside their worldview. It was already inside it, and perhaps fear grows strongest when something feels foreign. When death becomes alien, it becomes terrifying. When it is acknowledged as inevitable and structured, it becomes human. If you value this kind of historical reflection, not just events, but shifts in meaning, subscribe to Ancient History's Secrets, because history is not only about what happened, it is about how humans understood what was happening. And sometimes, the greatest changes are not technological or political, they are psychological.